Introduction to Clarissa. The first impression the reader receives from Samuel Richardson's masterpiece is of its great length, and rightly so, since that is an integral part of the work's reach and meaning. When we can breach this barrier, for it often is to us, however initially sympathetic we may be to the novelist's purpose and the concerns of his fiction, the next and lasting impression is one of power and effective complexity. To read Clarissa is not only to meet an indispensable document in the history of English and indeed European fiction in the 18th century, but also to become engaged with one of the greatest European novels, the haunting life which has been acknowledged by many and diverse successors of Richardson himself, and which, in surprising places in the text, still has the force to startle and the spirit to enmesh its modern audience. Certain problems not without their own intrinsic interest are met at the outset in reading Clarissa, problems that were present at the start of the novel's career. In this respect, the circumstances of the book's publication are more important in our own dealings with Richardson's fiction than is often the case with other works of literature. When the first two volumes of the first edition of Clarissa appeared on 1st December 1747, the 58-year-old Richardson was already well known and established, not only as one of the leading master printers in London, with a substantial business in Salisbury Square off Fleet Street, but also as the author of Pamela. The latter, indeed, had quickly become a cult novel after its first anonymous publication 7 years before, at the end of 1740. Nevertheless, in the runner-up to the appearance of his second and greatest novel, despite apparently his secure position as a citizen and as a writer, Richardson adopted a strangely deferential posture, and that in a society for which deference received and given was of prime importance. As early as 1744 to 1745, he was sending out manuscript portions of some draft of the novel, asking for help and receiving contradictory advice. He turned to two kinds of correspondence. A small group of professional men of letters formed part of his circle. Friends such as Reverend Edward Young, satirist, poet, and himself something of a cult writer, with his blank verse Night Thoughts, then in progress, and Aaron Hill, dramatist, poet, translator, and projector. More important, though, was a group of ladies, several young and unmarried, others older, for whom, as the fame of Pamela grew, Richardson became something of a guru in matters of private conduct and moral feeling. The subsequent impact of Clarissa widened this cluster of the novelist's intimates. Richardson was early worried about the length of his new work. Young, though asked to outline possible cuts, wisely refused. Aaron Hill more rashly sent suggestions that frightened and wounded the apparently deferential author in a pattern that may be discerned, in which Richardson invites collaboration, but ultimately demonstrates a very firm and conscious, even dictatorial adherence to his original purposes. Professional advisors became less important, but Richardson continued to ask for comments from his other acquaintances. So at the outset, the author, that apparently dominant actor in the drama of reading, has strangely shifting stance in the writing and the publishing of Clarissa. As well as discussing the major questions of the shape of the book and the incidences and the conduct of the narrative, the questions on which he never significantly gave ground to his critics or accepted advice he was offered, Richardson and his correspondents worried over the surface and details of the text. Just as he had revised Pamela for the second and subsequent editions and was revising it, so he worked on Clarissa. First in the changes he made in at least two drafts, then his adjustments to volumes 1 through 4 of the second edition of 1749 C2, later in the revision of the entire text of the third edition of 1751, C3, and finally in the negligible alterations made for the fourth edition of 1759. The first 4 volumes of C2 contain several thousand small but cumulatively important modifications of text, and to these added in C3 several larger alterations, mostly additions. 42 of the latter are more than a page in length, and 6 are more than 8 pages long. In all, C3 is 200 pages longer than C1. 2 articles by San Martyr, see page 28, set out a useful summary of these changes, with examples and with some indication of the patterns that may be discerned in them. Richardson had several ends in view in making the changes, but opinions vary not only as to his success in reaching these objectives, but, more contentiously, whether the sum of changes is a better work of art, a more pleasing creation, a more convincing story, and a truer tale, a more imaginative, engaging, and lively text. In short, the text too has shifted quality, though it is easy, particularly for an editor, harmless drudge, to exaggerate the final importance of all of this in a tract of writing so long and complex and dense. And it's also worth remembering that, for good or ill, Richardson's novels were printed on his own presses in his own shop. Richardson himself was careful to suggest that the editions were restorations by particular desire. This is from a letter to David Graham in 3 May 1750. He further printed 127 of these passages in a volume of letters and passages restored from the original manuscript of Clarissa, which he published in 1751 for the benefit of those who bought copies of C1 or C2. Also in C3, he signaled by marginal marks 168 such passages, or a line or more, though Shirley Van Marter reckons there are 739 of them. Mark Kindred Weeks, as long ago as 1959, see page 28, argued that much of this material was not restored at all, but new and inserted by Richardson to answer criticism by his readers, written, oral, and implied, which seemed to him to arise from inattention and misreading. It is difficult to judge in many cases whether a substantial passage has truly come from an earlier version, though on extraneous evidence 1 or 2 clearly have, or for whatever reason newly provided by Richardson for C2 or in most cases C3. One edition in C3 is a complete letter, Letter 208, Lovelace to John Belford. In this, the former outlines his fantasy of revenging himself on Anna Howe and her mother by kidnapping them on their journey to the Isle of Wight and arranging the rape of the maidservant as well as the mother and daughter, all culminating in the trial of Lovelace and his vassals. The men in court, in their hearts, acquitting the accused and the women disclaiming prosecution, were the case to be their own. The final outcome is Lovelace's cynical expectation of his own acquittal as leader, were it but for family's sake. All this is a typical bravura performance by Lovelace, both as a letter and as a piece of imputed defiance, well over the top and a pity to lose. It is designed, as many of the new editions were, to blacken Lovelace's character, yet is apparently truly omitted from the first edition. Sarah Westcomb wrote to Richardson on 14 April 1747, dominating the scheme for excision to shorten the book. One class of editions is, however, clearly new material, though only carrying further a feature of the text already present in C1. This consists of 22 omniscient footnotes by the editor, added to C2 and retained in C3. 18 of those already set out to blacken Lovelace, or, another reaction of Richardson to criticism, raise Clarissa. Many of the notes act against the subtle process of the unfolding the story in the letters by brusquely pointing forward in the following narrative, and the whole exercise must surely be seen as an attempt by Richardson to restore his control of the reader's interruptions of the novel, letters, text, as well as story. In turn, Richardson risked incurring some resentment by such distrust of his audience. A related class of alteration is to be found in C2 in the increased use of italics to nudge the reader's attention to significant words, phrases, longer passages, another development in directly forcing the reader's response that works to some extent against the strength of the epistolary form. Although there is not much surviving correspondence on the subject, it's hard not to suspect that he was following advice in the widespread, if small touches he introduced to make the writing throughout more noble and correct. This marks a stage in the flux and reflux in the novel as a whole, between generalized meaning and significant detail, usually the lower mimetic comedy, which the French translator, for example, did not like. Lovelace is deprived of puppy and cunning and whelp and remonstrance, and is given an awkward fellow and foolish. Clarissa's sooner than it agrees with my stomach dwindles to sooner than I should otherwise choose. Details of aristocratic titles and address are adjusted, a subject of which Richardson later defensively claimed to be ignorant, and Clarissa in C2 onward refers to her father and mother rather than the warmer papa and mama. All modern reprints, except Philip Stevick's abridgment of 1971, have reproduced some form of C3. It might be argued that the best text would be one that gave the reader a record of all significant changes that Richardson made in the text over the years. But this would be impossible in a clear, readable version of the novel, since not only additions are involved, but also omissions and revisions. It has therefore been decided that, on balance, it's best to reprint the text of the first edition. This may not please all readers, though it means that at last the earlier and later versions are easily available for comparison. The decision is taken between C1 represents Richardson's real intention, later frustrated by his reactions to criticism. But because this first edition is appreciably shorter, often livelier, and though the editions occasionally present worthwhile improvements, to a large extent the added material seems relatively inert. Although the latter may be the doubling in length of Joseph Lehman's Funny Servant, writing in letter 96, and two additional letters of the pandemic Eliasic Brand, letter 468 and letter 469. Here also are located more than a score of substantial passages praising Clarissa, most inserted after her death. The loss of a few scenes of lively writing and some improved syntax, the best of which is incorporated in editorial brackets, is judged to be outweighed by the gains. The latter point brings us to the critical significance of the publication history. Richardson's apparently deferential posture as author has in the past led him to his being incautiously patronized, to the extent of prompting surprise that one has, as Coleridge expressed it, of so very vile a mind, so oozy, so hypocritical, praise-mad, canting, envious, conspicuous, could command admiration and great of his correspondence. He was put down by later critics as a man of narrow reading, little education, and apt to quote inaccurately. His careful use of quotations assembled from several handy anthologies, such as such as Edward Broussard's Art of English Poetry, 1702, and many later editions, or The Beauties of English Stage, 1737, to establish Lovelace's background in literature and self-dramatizing fantasies, is comparable to many modern assemblages and is charted in the notes, page 1538, footnote. He is also preachy, and for this reason, perhaps his use of devotional literature was not given the careful consideration such as a deliberate literary gesture. But deserves a potent source of imaginative power. Despite all this, in Clarissa, he has had the luck or prescience to hit on a story that became a myth to his own age and remains so yet. He also has the imagination and the ability to give this story life in a fashion that awakens complexity within complexity, some of which is interesting to observe, becoming activated to a rich effect by recent developments in economic and social thought. Women's consciousness and critical theory. F.R. Leavis judged that Clarissa is really impressive work, but went on to say, it is no use pretending that Richardson can ever be made a current classic again. It has always been in print, however, and read Terry Eagleton, page 28, seems pushing on an open door when he suggests that only by using his particular box of tools might it be possible now become a great novel for us. His lively version of The Rape of Clarissa does indeed clamp a powerful reading on the struggling novel, reminiscent, it is ironic to note, of the opposing, consistent, and unyielding interpretation that Richardson himself, in terms of other apocalyptic vision, also sought to bolt together. It is not only some modern interests that have Clarissa into a classic, it has always been one. Richardson's fable is dramatic, full of, perhaps, irresolvable tension and violent. Clarissa Harlowe is a beautiful young woman of high intelligence, scrupulous moral judgment, strong resolution, and warm humanity. She becomes the victim of her greedy, implacable family. They seek to force her to marry Roger Solmes, whom she detests, but she becomes attracted to Robert Lovelace, handsome, intelligent, witty, debonair, who she allows herself to think may be rescued from a life of wickedness. He turns the full effect of his heartless and resourceful sexual encroachment on her, and in circumstances of cruel chance as well as deceit, she is inveigled out of her family house. At the center of the web of a lying harassment, she is imprisoned in a brothel, defies Lovelace, escapes, but is lured back into captivity, drugged and raped. She again escapes, and having been isolated from her family and friends, turns to the consolation of the oppressed virtuous of the future life, and she dies. Lovelace himself is killed in a duel with her cousin. Some of the tensions in the fable are worth parsing over. Clarissa, my girl, as Richardson often calls her in his letters, is clearly intended to be a model, but she is the victim, although an unlucky and to an extent a pitiable one, of her own pride in thinking that she could rescue Lovelace from his evil courses. Richardson plays down his original motivation by many small changes to the text and by his comments on the novel as he attempts to raise her and defend her against charges of over-niceness in not closing with Lovelace's ambiguous offers of marriage, i.e. accepting social necessity. Clarissa does, however, say in letter 467, as she nears death, "Poor man, I once could have loved him." A little earlier, in letter 368, she is momentarily allowed something approaching despair. "For I must my own, my dear, that sometimes still my griefs and my reflections are too heavy for me. All the aid I can draw from religious duties is hardly sufficient to support by staggering reason. I am a very young creature. Although the modern reader might wish for more flaws in her character, Richardson, despite his hankering after a Peregrine, does manage the difficult task of keeping us interested and involved in the inner life of the lady. Lovelace caused Richardson the opposite difficulty. Many readers of the novel have jibbed at the idea that Lovelace is at once so attractive, amusing, and so bad, a liar and a bully, spying through keyholes. The tension between the attractive side of Lovelace and his corrupt and villainous behavior insolently justified by his code of honor, personal integrity, and misguided intelligence, is a very powerful one. Richardson was stung by the wish expressed by many of his contemporaries for a happy ending that would show Lovelace to have been good after all, a subject worthy of repentance, and consistently tried by many changes to make Lovelace more consistently wicked. The tension is increased because Richardson has so completely imagined himself into the role of Lovelace that most of his letters are a tour de force, amusing and skillful. It is the contemplation of his actions and their effect, what his friend Belford calls, letter 258, thy barbarous villainy, that condemns him utterly, letter 279, as to that part of Clarissa's suffering which arises from extreme sensibility. I know nothing of that, and cannot therefore be answerable for it. Severe contradictory demands are made on the members of a propertied family of Clarissa's day, such as Richardson embodies, though to an extreme in the Harlowes. On one hand, the duty of a daughter is to obey, and the right of a father is to require obedience. On the other hand, a daughter has the right to be an individual living in peace and integrity, and a father's duty is not to be an oppressor. Perhaps Richardson's choice of James as the Christian names of the Harlowes, father and son, is an indication of the wider reverberation of this conflict of legitimacies. The two Stuart monarchs, James I, the royal insignificant, as the lawless and Lord Lovelace calls him in letter 272, and his grandson, James II, both claim the divine right of kings, the supreme manifestation in the state of male patri potestas, the divinely given right to life and death over his dependents, assigned to the head of a Roman family. But James II, like James Harlowe, younger, carried this notion to the demented lengths and destroyed his own power as king. It is rather curious that James Harlowe says in letter 459 of Lovelace, I had rather see the rebel die 100 deaths than be a relation to my family. Were the Harlowes imagined as having been supporters of James II during his brief reign as a quick way of advancement, and perhaps Jacobites for a space of explaining the son's name before 1714, when the Hanoverians came in, just as politically the rights of subjects in the later 17th century and thereafter could successfully withstand such naked exercise of sovereign power as James II's autocracy. So the notion of personal independence, first in young men, but in Richardson's time in women too, could at least be plausibly asserted against parental power. If, as many sad instances more than prove, it is not always vindicated. In the latter argument, Richardson in his correspondence shows himself unequivocally in favor of the dependence of women, but in his story itself, the conflict is unmediated. Clarissa's defiance of her father is right, but her sense of guilt at her conduct is also apparently right in the eyes of the author. In the novel, there are many direct expressions of defiance by women. Chiefly Clarissa's confidant, Anna Howe. The events of the tale, however, frustrate Anna's most active initiatives and make them counterproductive, though this would argue that she was wrong only in a simple allegory, certainly not in Richardson's complex fiction. Clarissa herself, in her farewell letter to her brother, letter 490, effectively rebukes him with the comment that he is, however unjustly, an only son, more worth in the family account than several daughters. The word account, with its commercial overtones, is an indictment of the mercantile ethos of the Harlowes, who, in their own calculations, oppress the human spirit at their peril. Other points of tension in the story also concern Clarissa's role. One is her categorical refusal to enter into any relationship with Lovelace, except on her own scrupulous personal terms. This criticism of the story, which first surfaced at the time the novel was published as strictures as her overniceness, is touched on later and caused Richardson trouble. A related point is the part her rape plays in the story. Lovelace's fantasy of his own life is often taken from theater. He constantly associates himself with the macho, autocratic princes of Restoration heroic tragedy, seeming ironically to forget that they mostly perished by their own attempts at dominance. But he also seeks to turn Clarissa's part in his sexual pursuit into a part Restoration comedy, a comedy in which her abduction, harassment, and rape would be followed by his at least express repentance, a country dance, and marriage. Clarissa, however, turns the story into something else. A tragedy? She certainly at the end styles herself as a heroine, appearing in the heroine's white costume of the tragic stage, and apparently accepts her own death as the only outcome of her rape. All these and other tensions in the story are tensions of myth, not the discontinuities of a poorly constructed tale. They resist allegorizing and touch on the conflicts in the life of Richardson's day between social and communal norms and personal assertion. Conflicts which are also yet unresolved in our own time and, in some respects, exasperated. Richardson inserts this powerfully contradictory story in that requires constituent of the realist novel, an elaborate, well-worked-out context of economic relationships. The Harlow family, relatively new, established as extensive landowners, are consolidating their landed property. Hence the importance of matching Clarissa, a pawn in the chess game of competitive asset winning, with the holder of contiguous estates, Roger Solmes. The match appears to the lady not unlike the union of Beauty and the Beast, with no magical resolution possible. Solmes is thus presented by Clarissa, sitting squatting in it with his ugly weight, beginning to set his splay feet. Ugly creature, what at the close of day quite dark brought him hither? The amassing property has driven James Harlow Sr. unnaturally to resign his power as head of the family to his rash and thrusting heir. The consequent demoralizing psychic disturbance has forced Mrs. Harlow into withdrawal, in abdicating her responsibility as wife and mother. Arabella Harlow is bent on asserting her superiority as the elder sister with all rights and privileges in rank and property that she imagines this place makes hers. Clarissa, however, has been endowed by her grandfather with an estate. My estate, the enviable estate which has been the original cause of all of my misfortunes. Letter 237 through 230. Yearning to be the obedient daughter to a loving father, she resigns the profits of her estate entirely into his hands. But the very fact that this part of the family possesses was bequeathed to her affronts her brother. In letter 231, Lovelace himself comments on her reproach that she is cast from a state of independency into one of obligation. She never was in a state of independency, nor is it fit a woman should, of any age or in any state of life. It is perhaps worth noting Clarissa's position in law. Had she married Solmes or Lovelace? By common law, which governs party marriage until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, the husband on marriage became the entitled to the rents and profits derived from his wife's land, and acquired a freehold estate in them during the time she was his wife. After her death, he was entitled to a life estate, courtesy in the freehold lands of his wife, while he survived her, if there had been or were children of the marriage capable of inheriting. The husband also acquired an absolute property in the chattels, personal or movable goods belonging to his wife. He could dispose of them during his life or by his will if he died intestate. His wife had no claim to them. The wife, it is true, was entitled on her husband's death to an estate for life in 1/3 of his lands. The settlement made before marriage, a constant bait dangled by Lovelace, could by negotiation provide for a more generous provision for the wife. Divorce could be obtained before 1857 only in 2 ways: from bed and board, a kind of judicial separation granted by the ecclesiastic courts, or from the bond of marriage by private and a costly act of Parliament. Clarissa's attempts to give her father the profits of her estate failed to ameliorate her brother's anger or her sister's jealousy, or indeed her father's displeasure at her apparent independence. Richardson never brings the angry father into a direct reported scene or action. He is left growling downstairs, raging through the claustrophobic interior of Harlow Place, in terrorizing proximity to his tormented younger daughter, a sign perhaps of the difficulty Richardson had with the representation of such a complex and contradictory situation. Lovelace is much grander than the Harlows, whose country house he scorns in lofty tones. Everybody knows Harlow Place, for, like Versailles, is sprung up from a dunghill with every elderly person's remembrance. Letter 34. He is the nephew of a peer, albeit a rather middle-class nobleman. Lovelace himself behaves aristocratically enough. He's rich and expects to inherit more. His uncle, Lord M., would like him to go on into Parliament, and on his death can probably ensure that his nephew in turn would be granted a peerage, since he cannot inherit one. Lovelace is the leader of a band of young men about town, not quite Mohawks or bully boys. He has traveled abroad and is well read. The notes of his letters detailing references to books and plays, irrespective of Richardson himself, got the references he assembles. Lovelace may be seen as a leader who is unable to exercise any useful purpose of the dangerous, aristocratic, and perhaps outmoded talents for fighting, stratagem, and organization which would have been bred in him, and which inimical to society in which he lives. This society seems receptive only to the rise of the Harlows and their like, with the greed and mercenary relationships and more obsessive family coercion. It is tempting to oppose the old aristocratic family of which Lovelace is next in line as head, and the new middle-class Harlow family, but we have to take into account the Harlow-like origin of some of the aristocratic families of the time, and the fact that the Harlows themselves are country gentlemen. Richardson does use names, though Lovelace, recalling the Cavalier poet, or Mowbray, Tourville, or Montague, Belton, to suggest the insolences of the ancient aristocratic Norman yoke. As well as the estates and bequests of inheritances, other financial connections are important and detailed as the rents of the lodge and houses, the business of the shopkeepers, like the Smiths in which Clarissa dies, the cost of Clarissa's out-of-work Irish actor, who is available to assist Lovelace in his schemes, is also a smuggler. he perishes by that apparently glamorous self-interest trade, dangerous entrepreneurial lawlessness, legitimated by dubious political dissent. In short, he is a down-market version of Lovelace's own arrogance, forced to steal for his living. Mrs. Sinclair's brothel is a superior establishment, run on business-like lines, and her strongest objection to Lovelace's obsessive conduct over Clarissa is that it's interrupting trade. The personal, moral, and social, and of course economic aspects of prostitution were constant preoccupations of 18th century London, and in the second and third decades of the century it was widely canvassed in periodic writing and elsewhere that the problem of prostitution was out of control. Though lightly, if perversely, touched on in Clarissa, were it constantly juxtaposed in the heroine's purity, this question is a good example of both the protean shapes in which a single theme is likely to assume in the hands of Richardson, and of the way the threads of social history are also woven into a moral fabric of his novel and used in elaboration of his characters. The presentation of the novel through letters is of course at the center of Richardson's art, and it is in fact a phrase from a letter by Lovelace, letter 22:4, that is often used to draw attention to one of the strengths of this form of fiction. I love to write at the moment, as well as thoroughly exploring all the psychological richness and the narrative force of indirection which the complexity of interweaving letters creates. Richardson allows his imagination to play around the letters as constructed objects. In the letter just mentioned, Richardson goes on to remark, editor's italics, these trembling fingers, which twice have refused to direct the pen, and thus curvily deform the paper. A little later, letter 229, he physically before our eyes exults in his scrupulous dishonesty. I'm always careful to open covers cautiously and to preserve seals entire. In letter 232, his demonic energy is embodied in my shorthand writing, as he adds a little later one of the inimitable touches that makes the modern villain of contemporary European imagination. Lovelace's is ever cornered Jack. Lovelace's language, the most intricate, powerful of the languages that Richardson creates in the letters, is just that, a language. In letter 256, he says, I write as it is, was spoken, one of my peculiars, adding later, familiar writing, but talking, Jack. The body of the novel is made up of letters written between Lovelace, just over 170, including inserts unnumbered by Richardson, and his friend Belford, almost 80, and between Clarissa, about 190, and her confidant, Anna Howe, just 60. In its sparkling surface, the impulsive Anna Howe, her language goes with Lovelace's, creating for her a character of amusing and likable warmth, though her well-meant interventions are sometimes damaging to Clarissa's interest. The lady has a sharp edge in her writing, a directness that underlines her own final superiority as a human being to her stylish and, at first, apparent all-powerful oppressor. The regretful shift of the self-critical Belford's allegiance from the masterful Lovelace to the final Christ-like Clarissa is charted with believable sobriety in a language that is kind of the norm. The disposition of letters from the different correspondents is an important part of Richardson's conscious artistry, working with careful indirection, and is in contrast to the naked direction of the reader's judgment, discussed above in outlining the changes he made to successive editions of the novel. Roughly, from letter 1 to letter 190, into Clarissa's captivity, the story is seen through the eyes of Clarissa, with Anna Howe's comments and reactions, coming to rest on a more choric remarks by Belford and Lord M. Lovelace's voice does not sound even briefly from letters 26, from letters 191 to letter 293, Clarissa's escape after the rape. Lovelace is by far the dominant voice thereafter to the end. Belford becomes increasingly the reporter's voice, with dramatic insertions, and finally the inclusion of Clarissa's post-humorous messages. The movement of the book may be broadly outlined as follows: the invasion of Clarissa's life by Lovelace, who becomes more and more dominant up to her flight from Harlow Place, which he instigates but does not force in outright terms. In her captivity, Lovelace finally overplays his hand with the brutal aggression of the fire. From the time he escapes, even though he tricks her back, Clarissa's power increases. The rape is Lovelace's act of despair and marks his concomitant decline. Thereafter, she moves toward apotheosis and collapses. The book ends in an enigmatic coda with Lovelace's death. A more elaborate analysis would reveal more elaborate symmetry, with earlier passages in letters or episodes finding their answer, voices in the latter parts, and effective juxtapositions of powerful and affecting writing or action with comic narrative and low scenes. The variety of strength of this well-worked-out texture lie in the careful manipulation of point of view and self-examination, as well as comment and judgment. The chronology of the story is only one of the obvious instances of Richardson's extreme care and meticulous arrangement. The first letter is dated 10 January, and the last letter 537, reporting the death of Lovelace 2 days before, is dated 7 December. The year is not specified, and indeed a footnote to Clarissa's will, letter 507, says the date of the year is left blank for particular reasons. No day of the week is given within a date of the month until letter 11, Wednesday, March 1, so that we cannot know whether or not it is a leap year. The relevant years on which March 1 fell on a Wednesday are 1721, 1727, 1732. In letter 130 and letter 131, 30.1, detailing Lovelace's pretense at finding a house for Clarissa to live in after their marriage, mention is made of some of the new streets about Governor Square. Since the square and its surrounding streets were laid out by Grosvenor Estate from 1725 onwards, perhaps 1732 is the most likely year. The precision of the dating, Clarissa's leaving Harlow Place on the evening of Monday, April 10, her rape on the night of 12 through 13 June, her death at 6:40 p.m. on the evening of Thursday, 7 September, puts the carefully arranging author full of artifice at the center feature of the novel, namely its sampler-like quality, the presence of affixed and elaborate objects for contemplation. The static of Richardson's fiction is acknowledged by his preparation and publication of a collection of moral and instructive sentiments, maxims, cautions, and reflections contained in the histories of Pamela, Clarissa, and Sir Charles Grandison, digested under proper heads with reference to the volumes and page. This is 1755. This, too, in particular form lies behind Dr. Johnson's famous remark recorded by Boswell. Why, sir, if you were to read Richardson for the story, your impatience would be so much fretted that you would have to hang yourself. But you must read him for the sentiment, and consider the story as a given occasion to the sentiment. There is a contrasting dynamic side to Clarissa, however, where all the sentiment, the arrangements, the objects of contemplation are qualified and further complicated by the movement of the story. The languages of the correspondence, the process of reading. It is perhaps here that Richardson's supreme genius as a novelist lies. Many of the important constituents of Richardson's fiction discussed above, indirection, juxtaposition, movement, unfolding, psychological life, shifts of tone, the establishment of the author's solid presence, need a great deal of room in the novel and a substantial commitment of reader's time. The length of the book looks daunting, but familiarity with it turns the length into virtue. It is easy to see why Richardson was, as he expressed it, a poor pruner. As he went to cut, the novel grew under his hand. He simply saw more of the fiction locked in the text, waiting for embodiment. There are further exchanges of letters frozen in passages of indirect reporting. Letter 151, 157, letter 158. And there are whole novels implied in episodes like the involvement of James Harlow Jr. with a lawless shipment, or Anna Howe's plan to rescue Clarissa by means of the higgler, Mrs. Townsend, and her free traders. It may be easily seen that the richness of the novel is likely to be explored to good purpose by many of the different kinds of the theoretical and contextual criticism of fiction which have been developed in recent years. The way in which the characters are established by their own writing at length is open to comment in psychological terms. Two good and related examples of this are Clarissa's Dream, letter 84, Mr. Lovelace stabbed me in the heart, and Mr. Lovelace's 417. The reading of Lovelace's Dream, at least, would seem, however, to be quite complex, since Richardson himself has clearly constructed part of it, indicated by Clarissa's azure robe, all stuck with stars of embossed silver, as a symbolic Baroque religious painting of the Virgin Mary in it. Lovelace is a damned soul, and then in hard to relate, the floor sinking under me, as the firmament opened for her. I dropped into a hole more frightful than that of Eldon. The psychological theory must become a complex analysis involving traditional, developed Christian symbolism. A similarly symbolic touch, one of the myriads that are witness to Richardson's relation to older forms of art, is to be found in letter 233. Lovelace, slouched and muffed up as an old man, has run Clarissa to earth at Miss Moore's Inn, Hampstead, as he pries around, ready to throw off his disguise, and pounce on the lady like a pantomime demon. A long-running characterization by him, he stumps toward the closet, over the door of which hung a picture of St. Cecilia, a common print after the Italian master. It is presumably a print of Raphael's painting of St. Cecilia, a Roman lady of good family who wished to devote herself to heaven by a life of celibacy, but who was compelled by her family to marry a young nobleman, Valerian, whom she converted and who joined her in martyrdom. The text invites theoretical analysis, but itself offers many, some conflicting lines of suggestion. Richardson's conscious and perhaps unconscious elaboration of text in the letters themselves, as well as his shimmering presence as an author, create a work that is not only fruitfully tackled by structuralists, but seem in a certain way to be designed by the author to be so tackled. The myth Richardson employs is a powerful one, involving the relationship between women and men, the family, and marriage. Since Clarissa's part is so extensively and solidly imagined, feminist criticism is vital, not only of the story as Richardson's construct, but also of Clarissa and Anna Howe's writing. This should go far beyond a critique of the novel as a report by a man, even a very empathetic man, on a women's place in the 18th century society. The novel is strong and substantial enough to search to the most fundamental truths about the relations between the sexes. Richardson has a straight, expressed, conventional opinion, stressing male dominance and the necessity for this in a well-organized family. But his fiction as a whole seems more obliquely to suggest encroachment on the one part and submission on the other, by women and men both, as the likely outcome of many, if not most, relationships. The historical and economic context of the myth, impressively imagined, has also elicited compelling readings of the novel. To all these theories must be added Richardson's own increasingly crude didacticism. He worked as successive versions. Clarissa's death proves to be the test of all theories. In her death lies one of the most difficult problems for Richardson himself. She cannot be seen to will her death. That would be suicide, or for a paragon, impossible. She has been forced to abandon any hope for the expression of her love in this world. The only opening for her is the expectation of a future state. It is a remarkable feature of the book, and doubly so in our eyes, that Clarissa's rape is only mentioned, but her death is embodied at great length, with elaborate Christian symbolism. She becomes like Job, whose words she constantly quotes, the type of Christ, and takes on herself the sins that men and women have committed against her. Her death confers grace on believers. This is difficult to accept for most modern readers who are yet deeply affected by her end, even if they may feel that Richardson moved towards celebrating it too elaborately. Is her death a denial of life, a manifestation like Lovelace's life and death, of a destructive love or lack of it, or does she merely die of galloping consumption to complete the pattern? Is it a technical and formal problem in the great Baroque composition of running figures, answering passages, symbolism, and doctrine? We may conclude by saying that Richardson's great work has up to now resisted being merely exemplification of any theory, including his own. His book lives, however, not only by complexity, that the theories again include his own useful organization and tease out, also perhaps become that at the same time a master of staple skills of narrative, such as suspense, indirection, and even speed where necessary. His fiction also moves the reader deeply. We come to trust the text, and we do not distrust it, and we do distrust it, and when we do, and where we do distrust it, our distrust leads us to ask really important questions about human life and conduct. The narrative is like the snake with its tail in the mouth on Clarissa's coffin plate, and the novel ends as it begins with a duel. Dueling is touched on as a kind of running motif. Example in letter 346, where Hickman stands up to Lovelace's bullying, and balancing this in letters 442 and 443, where Lovelace and Colonel Morden growl at each other like two wary dogs, mostly in Lovelace's mocking but serious assent to the male chauvinist Rake's creed. But the serious and dense use of all this comes where the reader is faced with Lovelace's last words, reported by Latour in letter 533, "Let this expiate." Dueling is not completely wrong, the Rake's creed representing something that cannot be completely dismissed. Lovelace's death at the hands of Clarissa's cousin does not expiate. It is the final act of Lovelace's fantasy, his imperious will to make all actions meet his own interpretations. At the same time, it is not without pathos, if not tragedy, since it is a distorted image of excellent qualities. Lovelace's death and last words are to be contrasted with Clarissa's and placed in context of deathbeds, Belton and Mrs. Sinclair's. It also reflects back on Clarissa's death, and that reflection becomes less simple. This is a kind of echoing meaning that gives Clarissa a peculiar pallor.